Please be seated. A couple of special welcomes. Can you hear okay? Is the microphone up loud enough? Yeah? Can you hear okay? Mike, can you hear okay? Okay. A special welcome to Jess and Lil Baim, whose kindness makes all this possible. Thank you so much. Shep Nachas. Rigo, if you can give me a little more volume on this mic, I'll be a happier Jew. Thank you. A very special welcome to my teacher and mentor, Rabbi Harold Schulweiss, who's with us tonight. Rabbi Schulweiss, and looking good. And a dear old friend and teacher of mine, my bar mitzvah teacher, Cantor Avram Schwartz, is here. So, Cantor Schwartz, thank you for being with us. Our guest tonight is Rabbi Sharon Brous, who's the leader of the IKAR community. And in the second half of our program, we're going to be talking with Sharon Brous about how Heschel's philosophy shapes the contemporary Jewish world. But to begin with, we're trying to take a look at this philosopher. So if you have the sheet, have it open in front of you. I was 17 years old. I was a freshman in college, and I got a letter from my rabbi asking me when I came home for winter break if I would participate in a college homecoming Shabbat, Gesundheit. And I called my mom and I said, Mom said, are you going to go? And I said, no, I don't really want to go. I really don't want to go back to that shul. I mean, I love the shul and I love the people in the shul. I just didn't like the services very much. Apologies, Cantor Schwartz. And so when I got home, the rabbi called. He was very kind, and he said, come see me. So I went to see the rabbi, and he said, what's your problem? And I said, Rabbi, I love you. I love the cantor. I love the people in the shul. I've grown up at this shul. I just can't daven here. Just like nothing happens during those services. And I just can't go back. I just don't want to do it. It doesn't move me in any way. He says, turn around and take the orange volume off the third shelf. So I turned around, I got this orange volume off the shelf. He said, open to page 1 and read. So I opened the book, and this is what I read. It is customary to blame secular science and anti-religious philosophy for the eclipse of religion in modern society. It would be more honest to blame religion for its own defeats. Religion declined not because it was refuted, but because it became irrelevant, dull, oppressive, and insipid. I said, hey, he's been to our shul, you know. That's us. Irrelevant, dull, oppressive, and insipid. Right? When faith is replaced by creed, worship by discipline, love by habit, when the crisis of today is ignored because of the splendor of the past, when faith becomes an heirloom rather than a living fountain, when religion speaks only in the name of authority rather than the voice of compassion, its message becomes meaningless. I said, I love this. Who is this guy? So this is Abraham Joshua Heschel. To take the book home and learn it. And that was my introduction to Heschel. Abraham Joshua Heschel, born in 1907 in Warsaw, to a great Hasidic family. So like Buber last week, Heschel is shaped by Hasidism. On his father's side, he is 7 generations from the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidism. On his mother's side, 6 generations from the Maggid of Mezrich, the great theoretician of Hasidism. Heschel was an Ilui as a child. He was a child genius. Already by the age of 3 and 4, they were saying he's the next big Hasidic star in Europe. But when he was 16, his father died, and his uncle took over his education. And his uncle and his mother realized that there was more to him than could be contained in the Hasidic world. Heschel was sneaking out of the yeshiva late at night, sort of like in the book The Chosen, and going down to the end of the block where there were coffee houses where Yiddish poets would share poetry. And Heschel was writing poetry. It was mystical love poetry. And he would read it in these coffee houses. And his mother and his uncle realized that the community could not contain him. So they sent him away. They sent him to Vilna, to a secular Jewish high school, where he snipped off his payas and put on a cap and became a student of European culture, of literature and music and art, of science, of social science, and he fell in love with the wisdom of the European culture. When he graduated, he didn't go back to the community where he would have been appointed Rebbe. Instead, he went to Berlin. Berlin in the late 20s and early 30s was the world capital of humanism, the world capital of humanistic sciences. And he was part of a whole generation of young Orthodox yeshiva kids who had reached out to European culture to try to understand modernity. The tradition is, and I don't know if it's true, but there's a tradition that he shared in the same apartment building. He lived, Yoshe Ber Soloveitchik, who would become the head of Yeshiva University, we're going to learn about him next week, and Menachem Mendel Schneerson, who would become the seventh Lubavitcher Rebbe, all lived in the same apartment building. You imagine what Shabbos in that building was like. Heschel studies philosophy. He studies the philosophy of aesthetics. He studies Semitics. He studies ancient history. And at the same time, he didn't go to the Orthodox rabbinical school because he knew all that stuff already. He went to the Reform rabbinical school because he wanted to know what they knew. And he gets an extra smicha. He now has two different smichas. He finishes his studies in 1939. Just before the Germans invade Poland, he goes back to see his family and begs them to leave Europe with him. He has a visa to go with an uncle, lives in London. But his uncle was the head of this Hasidic community in Warsaw, and his mother was his sister and couldn't leave. So he says goodbye to his mother, goodbye to his uncle and to his sisters, and he leaves, and he never saw them again. The war began 6 weeks later. He goes to London where his uncle is, and then from London he comes to Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, where he teaches for 5 years, and then in 1945 he comes to the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York City, where he spent his career from 1945 until his death in 1972. He married a woman named Sylvia Strauss, whose family belongs here. Jack Strauss was her brother. They have one child, Susanna, who today is a professor of religion at Dartmouth College, and she has a couple of kids. Heschel in New York is a fish out of water. Here is a religious man in a secular society. Here is a man of faith and spirit in a society that only knows science and skepticism. And he decides that it's his job to help scientifically oriented, skeptical modern people understand the meaning of religion. Religion for Heschel is a way of knowing the world. Science is a way of knowing the world, but it's not the only way. If you go to a scientist and you ask a scientist how far is the earth from the sun, he'll give you an accurate answer. If you go to a scientist and you ask him how a disease ought to be cured, he'll give you an accurate answer. But if you go to a scientist and you ask that scientist to explain love, scientists will say, well, you understand that there are certain proteins in the human body that are excited by certain enzymes. And when an enzyme is released into the brain, then you get a rush of it. You say, no, I want to know love. You realize that a scientist can explain to you the physiology of attraction, but he can't explain to you what we call love. If you want to know love, you find a poet or an artist. If you want to know facts of science, you find a scientist. Each of these are different ways of knowing the world. And for Heschel, religion is a way of knowing the world. But that's something that we forgot. And so he writes the following in an essay called Depth Theology. Take a look with me here. He says, where is religion to be found? What sort of entity is it? What is its mode of being? Now think about that. The question is very simple. Somebody comes and says, I want to know religion. Where do I go? Well, he says, one who is in search of art will find it in works of artists preserved, for example, in art collections. And one who's in search of literature will find it in books preserved in libraries. But where is the place of religion? So somebody comes and says, I want to know literature. Where do you send them? To the library, to a bookstore, to a literature class. And somebody says, I want to learn art. Where do you send them? To an art gallery, an art museum, or an art appreciation class. Somebody comes and says, I want to know religion. Where do you send them? What's an interesting question? He says, listen to what he says. Do visible symbols as preserved in temples, doctrines and dogmas contained in books, contain the totality of religion? When I was in college, I took Religion 1. Actually, it was 101 because I wrote a paper and got upper division credit for it. And here's what Religious Studies 1, undergraduate at the University of California, consisted of. First, we read all the books. We read the Old Testament, and we read sections from the New Testament, and the Upanishads, and the Quran, and the Confessions of Confucius, and the Confessions of St. Augustine. Then we visited the synagogue, the church, the monastery, the ashram, the mosque, the meditation center. And we met the practitioners. We met the rabbi. We met the minister. We met the priest. We met the imam. We met the guru. We met the meditation leader. Then I took a final exam. What's the meaning of jihad in contemporary Islam? Right? What is the role of Israel in Jewish thought? What does salvation mean for contemporary Protestants? And I got a B. Damn it. Now, having mastered all that, do I know religion? Symbols, institutions, ideas, rituals. Do I know religion? I'll give you better. I went to Hebrew school. Right? I went to Hebrew school, and I had to learn which way do you put the Hanukkah candles in the menorah, and which way do you have to light them. And I still can't remember that for the life of me. You know, name 6 animals that are kosher and 4 animals that are not. That's not so hard to do, you know. And you learn the facts. What's missing from that treatment of religion? Listen to what he says. Religion, he says, has been reduced to institution, symbol, and theology. That reduction, I'll translate the next sentence for you, hang on, does not affect the pre-theological situation, the pre-symbolic depth of existence. To redirect the trend, we must lay bare what is involved in religious existence. We must recover the situations which both precede and correspond to theological formulations. We must recall the questions which religious doctrines are trying to answer, the antecedents of religious commitment, the presuppositions of faith. Don't worry, I'll translate. One more paragraph. To some, the truth of religion is ritual. That's why all the people think that you're measured as a Jew depending on how firm you are. Right? So, you know, for Hanukkah once, I gave my cousin a thermometer, you know. You stick it in the ear of a Jew and it gives you a digital readout of how firm they are. And now there's no question anymore, right? To others, the essence of religion is dogma. What do you believe in? There is another component, however, which may be regarded as the vital ingredient. And yet, because of its imponderable nature, it often escapes the eye of the observer. It is that which goes on within the person, the innerness of religion, vague and often indescribable. It is the heart of religious existence. Ritual and myth, dogma and deed remain external unless there's a response from within the person, a moment of identification and penetration to make them internal. What's he talking about? Here's what he's talking about. Take any expression of religion. Any symbol, any text, any idea, any institution, any ritual, and ask yourself, what happened to the guy who created it? That impelled him, that compelled him to create this? What inspired him to create this? Heschel's going to argue that underneath religion is a common repertoire of human experiences. But because we don't often make the connection between the expression of religion, the rituals say, and that experience, the rituals remain dead. I'll give you 2 silly examples. One serious, one silly. Serious example. The most famous psalm in the book of Psalms, the 23rd Psalm. You all know it by heart. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me lie down in green pastures. He has me lie down beside still waters. And though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. You all know that psalm. I can teach you that psalm. I can teach you that psalm in English. I can teach you that psalm in Hebrew. When I was in seminary, we had to go home and look up all the Ugaritic roots, all the ancient Near Eastern language origins of all the words in the psalm. I can show you how the psalm is used in the prayer life of Jews and Christians and others. I can teach you all about the psalm, and you still won't understand it. Not until the day that you go to the doctor's office with the person you love, and the doctor puts an x-ray up on a screen, and he says, that white spot is cancer. I think I can get it out. And you say, what do you mean you think you can get it out? He said, well, it's kind of tough because it's wrapped around this vein or this artery here. And it's a very difficult surgery. And suddenly there's a chill that crosses you. And suddenly you understand what he meant when he said, I walk in the valley of the shadow of death. And then you feel the hand of the person you're with, and you hold that hand very tightly. And you realize that's what he meant when he said, "You are with me, and I'm not afraid." Until that moment, you will not understand that psalm. But after that moment, you will understand it for the rest of your life. That's what Heschel means. That every expression of religious life is an expression of a human experience that all of us know at some point or another in our lives, but you have to be connected to each other for the ritual to become alive. I'll give you a silly one. We do bar mitzvahs here at Valley Beshalom. Some mornings we do 2 of them. We have a custom here at VBS which was bequeathed to us by Satan. It's a custom of letting the bar mitzvah parents talk to the kid on the bima. So you come to shul, and every Shabbos morning, there are these parents, they look at the kid, and they say, "You know, you are the most wonderful child, the most brilliant athlete, the most excellent scholar, the most talented musician, you're the most beautiful kid. I don't know, my life was empty, meaningless, and void until you were born. You are the center of my existence." And you sit in shul listening to this week after week. Shirley's right here, and she does, and you say, "Oh, not again." Right? And then, then the father gets up and says, "Son, the synagogue is a second home to us." To which Rabbi Schulweis always turns to me and said, "Who are these people? I've never seen them in my life. I've been here since 1970. I've never laid eyes on this man." So I always say to him, "He must not get home very often, And you listen, and every week it's the same thing. It's like, why? Until it's your grandchild. And then there you are in the first row going, "You're the most wonderful child who ever lived." I mean, if it's your kid, it's different, right? If you're in the circle of celebration, it's a very different experience than if you're sitting in the back of the room, right? That's what Heschel's talking about. How do you convey a grandmother's, grandfather's nachas at seeing a 13-year-old stand on the bima and say, "This means something to me"? How do you convey the sense of fear of death and then the confidence that comes with knowing that I'm not alone in this? Each of the expressions of religion is based on a human experience, and if we don't go to the heart of that experience, we miss what religion is all about. Now, where did he get this idea? This is classical Hasidism. This is what Hasidism, Hasidut, was originally about. Hasidism was once a revolt against orthodoxy. I know that's hard to believe today, because the Hasidim you all know are super orthodox. But once upon a time, the Hasidim were the enemies of the orthodox. Because the Hasidim said that it wasn't the form of the ritual that mattered, it was the inner experience that came along with it. The classic Hasidic story goes like this. A Litvak, one of my ancestors, says to a Hasid, "You don't obey the law." And the Hasid says, "What do you mean?" And the Litvak says, "You don't daven at the right time. There's a time for Shacharis and a time for Mincha and a time for Mariv, and you Hasidim, you pay no attention to these rules. You do whatever you want." And the Hasid bows his head and says, "My brother, you're absolutely right. Let me tell you what happens. Every morning I get up, determined to pray on time according to the rules, and I take my talis and my tefillin, my siddur, and I go to the window and I open the window. I'm about to begin my prayers. Do you know what happens? The morning floods into the room. The sweetness of the air, the sun shining in the sky, the birds are singing, their children on their way to school, their grown-ups on their way to life, and I'm so taken with the music of the morning that I forget to daven on time. So comes evening, and I'm going to do it right. Evening comes, I take my siddur, I go to the window, I open the window, nebuch. The evening music enters my room, this peacefulness of the night, the shining stars of the sky, the sweetness of the landscape as families are united in their homes, and I forget to daven until it's too late. Says the Chassid to the Litvak, "I have a solution though. Tomorrow, I'll close the window." And the Litvak says, "God forbid," which is how you know it's a Hasidic story, right? Now, what's the point of this story? There's a whole bunch of stories like this, because these are stories that indicate that the ritual is only valuable as a vessel for containing the inner religious experience, and that religious experience is what religion is all about. These moments of communion, these moments of truth, and that the ritual only matters when the truth moment is present. That's what Heschel calls depth theology. And that, for Heschel, is what is missing in contemporary religious life. We do the rituals fine, but we don't connect them to those inner moments. Or we've lost the sensitivity for those inner moments. And that's his critique. That's his critique of contemporary religious life. And that's his criticism of modernity. That modernity not only has disparaged religion, and made religious people feel uncomfortable, that modernity doesn't recognize the power of those moments and the meaning of those moments for the construction of a human life. What religion needs to do is to remind us that those moments matter and to give us a sensitivity so that we might bring those moments close. And so what he's going to do in his philosophy is give us a vocabulary for talking about those moments of religious experience. And the first word in that vocabulary is going to be wonder. This is from the book God in Search of Man, the first third of which deals with this issue, developing a vocabulary for the inner life of religion, for the life of those experiences. Listen to what Heschel says. Wonder, which he then defines for us as radical amazement. Like regular amazement wasn't good enough. It's got to be radical amazement. Translate radical amazement, oh wow. Okay? Wonder, comma, or radical amazement, comma, is the chief characteristic of a religious person's attitude toward history and nature. Now, stop a second. When you read Heschel, it's like sipping really expensive wine. Okay? Take a sip. Swish it around in your mouth a little bit. Sit with it for a minute. If I were to ask you, what's the chief characteristic of a religious person's attitude, what would you say? You might say belief, or faith, or you might say observance, or affiliation. If you're the Pew Report, you'd say affiliation, right? You might say all sorts of things. Most of us would not have said that the chief characteristic of a religious person is his sense of wonder. When I was in Hebrew school, when I was in seminary, they didn't have any time for wonder. I had to learn 50 blot Gemara. Wonder? I mean, wonder was when we went outside, looked at snowing in New York, and wonder if I had to go teach Hebrew school or not. That was wonder. There was no wonder. But wonder, Heschel says, what is the chief characteristic of a religious person? A religious person walks around going, whoa! In the vocabulary of my generation, far out. Awesome in the vocabulary of my child's generation. Now think about that for a minute. Wonder. Who has wonder? Children have wonder. You give a kid a Hanukkah present, especially an expensive one. What happens? What does he end up playing with? The box. You spend all this money on a Hanukkah present. Then you spend all this time wrapping it. And then you bring it to the kid, and what does the kid do? He unwraps it, takes out the present, plays with it for 3 minutes, puts it aside, and then the box. Far out, a box. What can a box be? A box can be a fort. A box can be a tank. A box can be a car. A box can be a house. A box can be anything. A box. You ever watch a 3-year-old with a bug? It's the greatest thing in the world. Go to the nursery school over here, and I'll watch the kids playing. They have all these expensive toys. And then a bug will walk in the room, that cockroach or a worm, and the kid's like, whoa, whoa. You want the best thing? You give a 3-year-old, a 4-year-old, a graham cracker and a glass of milk, and you watch what happens. You ever watch try this. Great, you watch it, and what happens, right? Kid, ooh, you dip the graham cracker in the glass of milk, and then you rub it all over your body. Oh, and it's like pleasure. It's like, and I'm watching this saying to myself, if I could have sex once in my life that good, that would be all I need. Just once. Because It's just the kid is so satisfied. You know, I've been to the nicest restaurants in L.A. I've had desserts that cost me $22.50. Nothing compares to the joy this child gets out of a lousy graham cracker and a little glass of milk. You know, whoa. Wonder. Imagine if religion were designed to bring moments of wonder. Just think of that for a second. Look at the next line. Ready? One attitude is alien to his spirit, taking things for granted, regarding events as a natural course of things. What's the opposite of religion? The opposite of religion is not disbelief or skepticism or doubt. The opposite of religion is not profane or atheism. The opposite of religion is boredom. Boredom. The person who sits and goes, ho-hum, or in the vocabulary of my children, whatever. You know, my kids come to me and say, Abba, we're bored. I say, really? 527 channels on the television and you're bored? You're bored? I said, be bored. Talmud says I have to feed you, clothe you, teach you Torah, teach you to swim, and teach you a trade. Doesn't say anything about entertaining you. Be bored. You know why you're bored? Because you're boring. Because there's nothing in the world that you want to notice. Ho-hum. Bored. A person who walks the world and doesn't stop and say, woo, is a person who has no connection. That's the opposite of faith, says Heschel. Go to the next paragraph. This is the line that's on my desk. As civilization advances, the sense of wonder declines. What a great line that is. Translation. The more education you have, the more boring you are. And PhDs, boring. Why? Because they've done it all and seen it all and been there. Been to Paris? Yeah, twice, you know. Been to China? 16 times, you know. Been to Israel? Yeah, you know. All right, sit at home in Encino and be bored, you know. I mean, there's no sense of like, you know, whoa. That's what Heschel's looking at. Now, religion, he says, begins with that sense of wonder. Because it begins with a sense that there's something to attach yourself to in the world. If you turn the page over, awareness of the divine begins with wonder. It is the result of what we do with our higher incomprehension. The greatest hindrance to such awareness is adjustment to our conventional notions. So Heschel's going to build a ladder of ideas. He begins with wonder, then the next word is mystery, then the next word is awe, then the next word is, and he goes up until he gets to a set. He says, if you really cultivate this way of knowing the world, if you cultivate these aspects of your perception, at a certain point you reach a point in which something happens to you, something changes in your life, and that's the next paragraph. The sense of wonder, awe, and mystery does not give us a knowledge of God. It only leads to a place where the question of God becomes an inescapable concern, to a situation in which we discover that we can either place our anxieties in a safe deposit of opinions or delegate to others the urgent task of answering ultimate questions. Religion begins with a consciousness that something is asked of us. That is, if you really perceive the world with the sensitivity he's talking about, with wonder and mystery and awe, you come to a profound sense that the world needs you, that the world is asking something of you, that you are responsible for the world in which you live. That sense of responsibility is the true essence of attachment to God. Because God, for Heschel, is going to be revealed in the world through caring. God is revealed in the world through caring. God's essence you can't know, he says, metaphysically. But what you can know is that this is a God who truly cares for the world. And when you attend to the world and really attach yourself to the world, you attach yourself to that care and you realize that you are a vessel of that caring in the world. And so in the middle of Heschel's career, he makes a change. He's writing books. He writes God in Search of Man and Man is Not Alone. And then he translates his doctoral thesis on the prophets into English and publishes it in 1960. And then something changes in Heschel's life. He stops being a scholar full-time and becomes an activist. One of his best friends was Martin Luther King. Susie Heschel, who I happen to know, used to tell us stories about waking up to go to school in the morning and finding Martin Luther King sleeping on the living room couch. The SCLC had no money, so when King came to New York, he crashed at the Heschel's house. You know what it's like eating your Cheerios in the morning with Martin Luther King and Abraham Joshua Heschel? And Heschel goes to Selma, Alabama, and he marches with King. And there's a beautiful picture of this, where you see King in the middle and this tall, very stately African-American gentleman, that's Ralph Abernathy. And then next to him is this little white guy with a long beard. That's Heschel. And when he comes back to JTS, he comes back to the seminary, the professors are like, what are you doing? You're a professor. You're supposed to write monographs. You're supposed to write books. You're supposed to study religion. You're not supposed to go activism. And Heschel says, no, this is what I'm called to do in this moment. He comes to the White House Conference on Race, and he says, this is not the first conference on race. The first conference on race was between Pharaoh and Moses. That's what's at stake in civil rights in the United States. Heschel becomes a spokesman for civil rights in the Jewish community. Heschel becomes a spokesman for the plight of Jews in Russia. Heschel becomes a spokesman for the reforming of the Catholic theology toward Jews. He is invited by the Cardinal Beat, to come to Rome to renegotiate Catholic doctrine. He has to fly on Rosh Hashanah. And his friends say, but it's Yom Tov, you can't go. And Heschel says, think about how many Jews were killed by Catholics over the last 2,000 years because of these ugly ideas. If I can change their ideas, is that not pikuach nefesh? Is that not the saving of a life? Shortly before his death, in the winter of 1971, Daniel Berrigan, his friend, priest Daniel Berrigan, who was arrested by the federal government for ruining draft records of young men who were to be sent to Vietnam, Berrigan was to be let out of Danbury Federal Prison. Heschel goes to see him. Everybody said, don't go. He was sick already. He said, don't go. You're going to, it's not going to be good for your health. It's freezing cold. Heschel says, I have to go. Because when Father Berrigan comes out of prison, I don't want him looking into the eyes of the FBI. I want him looking into the eyes of someone who studies the prophets. He becomes this man of conscience because this is his theology. Something is asked of us. And if you look at the next line, the ultimate question bursting forth in our souls is too startling, too heavily laden with unutterable wonder to be an academic question, to be equally suspended between yes and no. We can no longer ask, is there God? In humility and contrition, we realize the presumption of such asking. The more we meditate, the more we clearly realize that the question we ask is a question we are being asked. Look at that again. The question we're asking. Now, what's the question we're asking? What's the meaning of existence? Does human life have a purpose? Is God real? Is a question we are being asked. Are you real? Does your existence have purpose? Are you ready to have a purpose for your existence? Man's question about God is God's question to man. The search for a God in life is really God searching for a partner in the world. Man's question about God is God's question to man. So now if you go back to the first line, go back to the first page. On the very first page of God in Search of Man, he offers this idea. Religion, he says, is an answer to man's ultimate questions. Now, the first time you read that, you say, well, that means that we are asking questions about the meaning of life, and religion comes to answer that. Now you understand that it's a double entendre. It's not just that religion is an answer to the question that we ask. Religion is the answer to the question we are being asked. God says, where are you? What are you doing with your life? How are you ready to take on divine purposes and divine responsibility in the world? And religion is a tool for helping a human being answer that question. It's not just an answer to the question we are asking, it is an answer to the question that we are being asked. To live a religious life is to answer God's question, where are you and what are you doing with your existence? This extraordinary man, Abraham Joshua Heschel, he died very young. He died at 65 years old in 1972. And when he died, No Jewish magazine printed a eulogy. The only magazine that put him on the cover was called America, which is the Jesuit magazine. Christians loved him. Jews couldn't figure out, who was this crazy man? Who was this crazy man talking about faith and wonder and demand and responsibility? Who was this crazy guy? It took 25 or 30 years. And at the end of the 20th century, when Jews began to return to something called spirituality, to prayer, to a different sense of what we are about, Heschel was brought back into the community. And today, 35 years after his death, almost 40 years after his death, he's the most important philosopher in the Jewish world. The most important philosopher in the Jewish world. Because here is a philosopher that opened up the doors to religious life, to a generation of modern people who felt alienated from religious life. And here is a philosopher who connected the search for a God in life, of prayer and ritual, at the same time with a deep sense of social responsibility. How Heschel becomes the shaping philosophy of contemporary Jewry, and what do you do with such a crazy philosopher with such incredible demands? That's why we brought Rabbi Brous tonight, to help us understand. So I want to welcome Rabbi Sharon Brous to VBS. Rabbi Brous is the founding rabbi of the IKAR community and a wonderful, wonderful teacher and inspiring Jewish leader in the community. And it's always wonderful to have you here. And I apologize to your daughters for taking you away from dinner. So let's begin with the simplest of questions. Why Heschel? What is it about Heschel's philosophy that has found a resonance at this moment in Jewish history? When he was alive, no one listened to him. When he died, no one listened to him. It took 25 or 30 years for the community to come, and now he's the most powerful thinker, the most powerful influence in contemporary Jewish life. And I know certainly at IKAR, there's so much of IKAR and so much, and when you trained at B'nai Jeshurun, so much of that community that has been shaped by Heschel's thoughts. Why Heschel?
Okay. Good evening, everybody. I'm so thrilled and honored to be here, and was so happy when Rabbi Feinstein called to invite me to come, and it's a great pleasure for me to be here in the presence of my teachers, Rabbi Schulweis and Rabbi Feinstein, and my friends. So thank you for having me here tonight. I'll tell you, my sense of why Heschel resonates so profoundly in this moment, and this has been really for a couple of decades, but his popularity and his prominence is only growing. And I think the reason why is because we all know people who have a deep and profound sense of the role of religion and spiritual depth in the world. And we all know people who know and understand how absolutely critical and essential social responsibility is, and how part of being a human being in the world means working to translate our core values into the ways that our cities and that our countries and our world actually look on the ground. Very rarely do those two sets of commitments come together in one personality. And I think it was Heschel who, he wasn't the first, but he was certainly the loudest and perhaps the smartest to articulate so powerfully the marriage of these two worlds, the marriage of the spiritual and religious commitments on one hand and the social and political on the other. So I'll just tell you, when I first was planning to move out here to Los Angeles from New York, I did an interview in a synagogue here in LA. And first of all, the committee, when I was studying at the Jewish Theological Seminary, where Rabbi Schulweis and Feinstein also studied, I had a kind of religious awakening in the midst of my time in rabbinical school, where I realized that the world was on fire, and I was studying Gemara 14 hours a day. And it just occurred to me that I needed to figure out how to translate my core Jewish commitments in a world on fire, which is a very different question from how to learn how to become a very good student of Talmud, but how to become, driven by the language of our tradition, how to actually live as a Jew in the world. So I went and started to study for a degree in human rights, and I studied at the law school at Columbia and the School of International and Public Affairs. When I came out here for this interview, so the committee that was interviewing me looked at my resume and said, "Why were you studying human rights at Columbia? Did you not think that JTS was stimulating enough? Was there not enough in the curriculum there to satisfy your intellectual aspirations? You had to look elsewhere?" And when I tried to describe my commitments to manifesting the world that I believe is the core aspiration of the Jewish religious tradition, so they said to me, "Look, if what you want is social action, you go to the Reform Temple down the street. We're about Talmud Torah. We do learning here. We don't do social action." And I think that, this is a particularly stark example of what I think happens all too often in the Jewish community, that we too often identify ourselves as places of serious prayer, or homes of serious learning, or places that take very seriously the call to social engagement, to social action, social justice. Very rarely do we see the integration of those core commitments. For Heschel, that was obvious. So this wasn't street theater when he went to Selma. This was him living out his core aspirations as a Jew and as a human being in the world. And that's a kind of integrated self that I think is extremely resonant today, particularly among younger Jews, many of whom have a kind of allergy to institutional religious life because they think that it only distances people from the heart and soul of what it means to be a Jew and a human being in the world. What they want to know is, how does what I'm davening on a Friday night affect the human being that I am on Sunday morning when I wake up after Shabbos is over? And if religious life can't answer that question for them, then they will happily sideline religious life. Heschel said to be a religious Jew in the world is to manifest those greatest aspirations, to pray and pray deeply, and then to go out and bring your core commitments to the street.
So let's take each of those in turn. Let's talk about to pray and to pray deeply. Okay? Many of us have a hard time praying at all. Many of us find prayer empty, stultifying, dull. Heschel found prayer a great adventure. You find prayer a great adventure. What is it about his thinking that illuminates your prayer life?
So I will say the introduction that you just heard is one of the most beautiful and powerful introductions I've ever heard to the teachings of Abraham Joshua Heschel. And what you described about wonder is precisely what I think is at the heart and soul of prayer. So often we walk into an institutional space and we're expected to be moved and to have some kind of experience there, but nobody gives us permission to have the experience of the heart in that formal structure and formal space. There's some people who can be moved nevertheless, but they're, I think, the rare exception. What I think we need to do is give people permission to actually experience awe and wonder and grief and longing and love and loss, and to experience that in the context of a Jewish prayer environment. So I once sat with a group of Jews in Los Angeles shortly after Rabbi Schulweis sent me away when I came here looking for a job and told me to go build something for the young people in the city, which I'm trying to do. And I sat with a group of Jews in a living room, and I said, "Tell me the last moving prayer experience that you had." Dumbstruck, right? Very few Jews can articulate a very moving Jewish prayer experience that they had. And then I handed them little index cards, and I said, "Write down the most powerful human experience that you have had from the depths of your heart when you felt touched and touched deeply." And people started to write the most extraordinary experiences about awe and gratitude and fear and worry and confusion, existential angst. And I realized that these Jews feel deeply, but they have no idea that what they're feeling can actually be connected to the Jewish prayer experience. They think that what the Jewish prayer experience is, please come in, sit down over here, you're already late, stand up, please rise, please be seated, turn to page 97. right? They don't understand that the Jewish prayer experience for Heschel and for us could actually be an opportunity to connect from the depths of our heart with one another and with God. And so this is what I think Heschel argues for us, is find the wonder again in the world and then pray from that place. Don't just find it in Yosemite, but when you're here on Shabbos morning, connect back to that sense of awe and wonder, and then sing out and cry out and sometimes dance from that place of wonder. So there's a teaching from Rabbi Natan Tzvi Finkel, Hasidic Rabbi, who says that the way to wonder, he comes to the same conclusion as Heschel, but he actually tells us how to get there. He says the way to wonder is to wake up every single day and to imagine that it's the first day of your life again, right? And to look at the world as if you're seeing those arches on those walls for the very first time, as if you're seeing the person who's sitting beside you for the very first time. And as there's a Benedictine monk named David Steindl-Rast who talks about this so beautifully. It's very Jewish what he says, right? If you actually look out at a crowd of people and you see not a crowd, but a series of individuals, each one with her own hopes and dreams and failures and achievements, each one of us with our own broken hearts, right? So then you start to live with a sense of wonder in the world. Everybody can do that. It's just that we don't realize that Ashrei is actually about that. And that when you stand for Aleinu, when you go down for Aleinu, it's actually also about that. And so this is about bridging the gap between what our hearts are capable of and what our liturgy is giving us the space to express.
So prayer is, at least purportedly, some sort of communication. So what does it mean? And many of us have a hard time with that part. And we can sing the prayers okay, and sometimes we even feel the emotions of the prayer, but the notion that there is a God who listens, or hears, or responds, or answers in some way. So where does that piece of prayer find its expression?
So I think that walking into a Jewish prayer environment trying to answer the question about God is the wrong way to start the conversation, because most of us are never going to get there, right? If the Kiddush is good enough, we'll come anyway, but we're not going to actually pray if we need to answer the God question.
We may be atheists, but we eat well, you know.
Right. So I believe, I've come to understand that Jews live dialogically, that we live in dialogue with one another, and hopefully with something beyond us, hopefully with God as well. But that Jewish life is really rarely lived in isolation. And so, I mean, think of it. The holiest of prayers in the Siddur, we're not allowed to say alone. The idea is, and I don't know if this is because we can't access that kind of holiness alone, or because we shouldn't be able to access that kind of holiness alone. I don't know if it's prescriptive or descriptive. But we can't say the Kedusha alone. That piece of the Amidah, that's the holiest piece, we can't say it alone. We can't say Mourner's Kaddish alone. We can't say Baruch Hu alone, right? There are certain aspects of prayers that can only come when we're with each other. We don't start by asking the question about God. We start by asking the question of who are the other 9 people who are going to make it possible for me to pray right now. Because once I'm in a room with 9 other people, I realize that my fears about my child and her progress in the world and her social struggle of the past week, my fears are not the only fears driving the world right now. And my incredible joy because my sister was able to get pregnant, that's not the only thing happening in the world. And my terror over what I just read that happened in a mall in Kenya last month, that's not the only thing that's going on in the world, because there are 9 other people here, and they also have their own terror and their own love and their own fear. And all of a sudden we're part of a chorus of human experience. And so once we're able to be in dialogue with each other, just simply by being present with each other, and maybe even opening up our mouths and singing together, so all of a sudden holiness becomes possible. I think that the way to God starts with connecting with each other, even in prayer. When I'm praying, I'm connecting with you. I'm not trying from the beginning of Kabbalat Shabbat to connect with God. I'm trying to connect with Eddie, because I know he had a hard week, and all of a sudden that opens my heart to the human experience. Or I know that something extraordinary just happened, and I want to celebrate his joy even though I had a rough week. once I'm able to open those chambers of the heart, I think together we're able to elevate and perhaps even experience the presence of God.
Okay, so one of the other obstacle, as it were, to people's experience of prayer is this the tradition, is the formal, the siddur, the Hebrew of it, the form of it, the halacha of it, the procedure of it, the whole sort of formal mechanism of prayer. So what would Heschel say is the purpose? I'm letting you channel Heschel, which is better. Yeah, I couldn't get Heschel to come, so I got Sharon. So you're channeling him just fine, thank you. And well, he never looked this good. That's maybe if you grew a beard. No. What's the role of a prayer book? What's the role of a tradition? What's the role of a systematic, articulated tradition of prayer, which is rather weighty, actually, if the purpose is to reach these moments of transcendent experience?
Well, one of my favorite books of Heschel's is Man's Quest for God, which if you're looking for, it's a very short text. It's one of the more digestible texts, I think, of Heschel's. Yeah. You can sip it like a cheaper wine a little bit. It's not exactly the finest, right? But in it, he speaks, he actually talks about what prayer is and how prayer can be achieved. And I think it's almost like a user guide for prayer. So I read it all the time. I've now highlighted it I highlight in different color highlighters every time I read it, so it's a multicolored text in my home. So Heschel speaks in this book about kava and kavanah, about the sort of fixed quantity of prayer, the timing of prayer, which is not optional. We are obligated, called by Jewish law to pray morning, afternoon, and night. The fixed language of prayer, which prayers must be said in order for one to have fulfilled his or her obligation. The sort of formal and fixed nature of prayer on one hand, and the very fluid and heartfelt nature of prayer on the other. Now, this again goes to the point about what was so utterly majestic and I think very different about Heschel. So there are Jews who fall on the side of kavanah. They're the Jews who want their hearts to be moved, and they will do anything for a profoundly moving spiritual experience. And there are Jews for whom that language, those sentences mean absolutely nothing, and they think that that's some kind of liberal, 21st century mumbo jumbo. That Jewish prayer is not about a movement of the heart; it's about getting up and davening and making a minyan, and being yotzei on your chiyuv, like getting through and fulfilling your obligation. But Heschel said it's actually about the dance between these two. That the power of our tradition is not to abandon one for the sake of the other, but to use keva as a kind of scaffolding that can hold the flow of the human heart. And so to use the structure of the matbeh tefillah to create the space for our hearts to cry out and call out in ways that we never knew that they could. Am I talking too much?
No.
Okay.
No, I'll tell you when you're talking too much.
So I'm going to give an example that for me, when I heard this story, I realized what Heschel was talking about. So I met a man actually at All Saints Church in Pasadena, of all places, named Yitzchak Frankenthal. So an Israeli man who came to give a talk. His son Arik was 19 years old. He was abducted by Hamas. And this was years before Gilad Shalit, and he was missing for several days. And it was one of those cases that everybody in the whole country knew his name, missing soldier, in the IDF. So Yitzchak tells the story that in the middle of the night, of course they weren't sleeping, but in the middle of the night he hears the knock at the door. And he goes downstairs to open the door, and he sees 3 generals standing at the door. And he knows what it means, right? Because this is how they deliver the news, that there's a soldier has been lost in the army. So he knows what this means, that they found Arik and he's not coming home. And here's what Yitzchak says. He says, in that moment, before they could even say the words, "We found your son and we're so sorry that he has died," Before they could even say those words, the first thought he had was, thank you, God, for giving me 19 years with this angel on earth. And he said, I understood in that moment why I had been davening mincha every day of my entire life, right? I was creating containers. And most of the time they were empty. There was no prayer in that container. I was making space so that one day when the time would come and I actually needed to be able to find gratitude for the gift of a child, even in the moment of the child's loss, I actually had it. And when he shared this with me, I thought that's exactly what Heschel's talking about in man's quest for God, right? The need to create, keva creates the space so that when the kavanah flows, we actually have a container to hold it in. So I think that we're mistaken when we throw away the traditional liturgy, when we throw away the siddur, when we throw away some of the formality of prayer, because we say it doesn't speak to people anymore. Instead, we have to introduce the idea of prayer in a way that people understand that it's a container to hold the expression of the human heart whenever it's ready to flow. And people need to know that it's not going to work every single time. Most days when I get up early in the morning and I have to get my 3 kids out the door and I'm already 15 minutes late to a meeting, I put on tefillin every morning. Most of the time nothing happens. But when it happens, it really happens, right? And I have a container that can hold the essence of life and death and love and loss when the moment comes.
The other theme of Heschel's, besides prayer, that's outstanding, and it's also, as you mentioned, one of the themes that you have built IKAR, the community, about, is this theme of social justice. And Heschel expresses this in his book, The Prophets, when he offers the character of the prophet as a person who sees the world through God's eyes and feels God's pain at the brokenness of the world in such an acute way that it basically drives the person out of his normal state of being into this sort of insanity that is prophecy. So the question is, how do you do that without losing your mind? How do you do that how do you really feel the world's pain without becoming crazy?
I was driving my girls to school the other day, and they go to school in Hollywood. And it was early in the morning, and there was a guy on the side of the street who was holding a sign that said, I want to survive. And he started approaching the car, and I have to admit, I felt a little bit vulnerable. I was a woman driving a car with 2 girls in the back seat, and I felt both scared and also totally just knocked over by this sign, because you don't usually that's not what it says on the signs. I'm hungry, I want to survive. And also we were a little late for school. So the light had changed, and I'm struggling with, do I teach the girls that it's okay to overcome your instinct that you might be unsafe because it's more important to give money, or do you say, like, we care deeply about the world, but the most important thing is to be safe, and right now I don't feel completely safe, and so I'm going to keep driving. I was sort of struggling with this, and so I just drove. So my girls burst into tears. And the girl said to me, did you see what the sign said? Why are you driving? What are you doing? And I said, it's very important that you feel safe when you're engaging in acts of justice, and you need to protect yourself, and especially as girls and later as women, it's going to be important. Okay, so then I drop them off, and then I pull over and cry, right? Because I know that I should have stopped the car, and in a way I taught them exactly the wrong lesson. The answer that I'm going to give you is the same answer to the prayer question, which is life for Jews is lived dialogically. That the prophet lived alone, right? The prophet lived in isolation from the world. As Yochanan Mef said so powerfully, he lived in the breach, in between God and man. He wasn't just completely aligned with God or completely aligned with man. He wasn't with either camp. He was the prophet. Isaiah and Amos and Jeremiah, they were yelling as much at God as they were at man, right? These were creatures who lived in utter isolation. These guys ran naked through the streets for years, trying to get people's attention, saying the world's on fire, and nobody seemed to care. the difference between a prophet and an activist is community, right? Is that the activist understands that work needs to be done and that they can't do it alone, because life is lived dialogically. So what do? They build Jewish World Watch, right? And then they go out and tell every single person that will listen about what's going on. And instead of screaming and yelling at people, say, come with me, we can do something about this. Because when you live in dialogue, when you see the sign that breaks your heart or reads the story that just shatters you, so you have someone to talk to about it and someone to strategize with about it and a way to respond meaningfully in the world instead of just sitting on the side of the road crying, because that's not actually helping anybody at the end of the day. So I think that, really the key is we don't actually want to be like the prophets that Heschel describes. If you read the introduction to the prophets, to the volume 1, right? It's one of the most powerful introductions to a book that I'd ever read until I just read that book, Why Do I Jump? Have you seen this? Right? This book that's written by a 13-year-old Japanese kid who has autism, who talks about what's going on internally for him. He's essentially nonverbal. Okay, so it's a diversion, but read the introduction to that book and it will completely change the way you understand human beings. It's extraordinary. But before that, it was Heschel's, the introduction to Heschel's prophets. So he, as he says, the prophets speak in an octave that human beings can hear, right? They're devastated by the reality of the world to such an extent that it's almost impossible for them to function. We don't actually want to be like those prophets. We want to be moved to act, but in a functional and communal way. And so we want to take the spirit of the prophets and actually live that out in the context of a community of people who are willing to stand up and actually fight in profoundly unpopular and uncomfortable and inconvenient ways. But we don't actually want to run naked through the streets, most of us, and abandon all social connections to one another. Do you agree with that assessment?
I actually do want to run naked through the streets, and in my new contract, I'm actually permitted that once a month. The difficulty is that the difficulty isn't the octave. The difficulty is the sense of despair in the face of overwhelming evil, in the face of the overwhelming brokenness of the world. So how does Heschel, how do you keep from falling into that sense of, like, it's just not going to help? It's just the depth of need and the depth of despair, the depth of need, the depth of brokenness, the depth of corruption is so profound that my voice just has been drowned out and it just doesn't matter anymore.
So the conference that you quoted earlier tonight, the first conference of race and religion in Chicago in the 63?
61, I think.
61?
Yeah.
So I read an account that at one point a white minister, maybe you've heard this story, a white minister stands up and says, like, it's too late. This country, it's basically, we've lost this fight. You can't change the hearts and minds of millions and millions of people who experience racism in horror of who they are. He said, it's too late. I have reached the point of despair. Heschel grabs the mic out of his hands and says, frankly, my friends, we don't have time to luxuriate in despair. Right? You know this story?
No, go ahead.
It's amazing, right? Like despair. Who has time for despair? I know that Christoph talks about this. I have compassion fatigue. Don't talk to me about Darfur anymore. I don't want to hear about Darfur. You know who has compassion fatigue? The people living in the refugee camps, right? They have fatigue. He just wrote a great piece about this, about the Syrian refugee camps, because everybody was talking about Syria for how long? 3 weeks? We were all talking about Syria. We were eating, sleeping, breathing Syria. And then all of a sudden we got bored with Syria, and we don't talk about it at all anymore. And he said, you want to talk about fatigue? Let me introduce you to this young woman who lives in the refugee camp in Syria and what her life is actually looks like. Despair, fatigue, it's a luxury of the privileged. And what we actually have to do is build a life around the question that Heschel asks, which is, what is your mission in the world? Why did God actually put you here? What's your purpose? And he says that every single one of us at some point in our lives feels the calling, right? We feel like, oh, maybe that's what I'm supposed to be doing. Most of us don't pay attention because we think it's a crazy voice inside our head. But Heschel says that's where you find out that your purpose in life is by exploring where that question leads you. And saying, maybe I was put in this world for this purpose, despite the fact that it's inconvenient, uncomfortable, expensive to deal with the problem that I feel moved by. So I think I'll tell you why we started IKAR, can I?
Yeah.
Okay. I was trying to think, if we started from scratch, right, and you can read Heschel's criticism of the synagogue from the 60s and from the 70s, and it speaks so powerfully today because we have exactly the same problems in the synagogues today that we had back then. I thought, well, what if we start from scratch? And we could create a Jewish space that would be designed to ask, to create space for the two great mentalities that Jews are called to hold at the same moment. Anochi afa ve'efer, I am but dust and ashes, I am nothing, which is essentially wonder, right? To be able to look out at the world and say, oh my God, right? That is exquisitely beautiful. That is incredibly majestic. That is awesome and powerful and far out, right? So,
don't make fun of my generation. We didn't create very much that's good. That was one of the things we created.
Some of my closest friends are from your generation.
Yes, right.
So on one hand, to say, Anochi afar ve'efer, and on the other hand, to be able to say, Bishvili nivra ha'olam. For my sake, the world was created, right? Which sounds like arrogance, but as Hartman says, it's really just adequacy. It's me saying, there's something for me to do in this moment, and if I don't do it, it might not get done. So for my sake, the world was created. And I think these are the two, obviously, very, very much persuaded and influenced by the writings of my teachers, of Heschel and Schulweis and Hartman. And I thought, well, what if we could start from scratch and build a community that's actually based on wonder and responsibility, and help bring people into a mindset where they're actually asked to hold both of those at the same time. Now, you might know the famous Hasidic teaching that a person's supposed to leave the house with two slips of paper in the pocket every day. On one hand, the slip of paper that says, I'm nothing. Anochi afar ve'efer, I'm but dust and ashes. In the other pocket, Bishvili nivra ha'olam. For my sake, the world was created. Because then, when you're on the basketball court and you just sunk your third, three-pointer, you pull out the, I'm nothing, really. What does this matter? And when you feel like you don't have a right to speak up, when your boss is sexually harassing your colleague, and you're afraid that you might lose your job, or you think there might be terrible consequences to this, you pull out the Bishvili nivra ha'olam card, right? For this moment, God put me in the world. So the Hasidim teach it this way, but they also teach it a different way, that when you walk into the place of prayer, the place where prayer is possible, to walk through two doors. One door is Anochi afar ve'efer. The other door is Bishvili nivra ha'olam. If you want to pray, you have to actually be in awe and wonder, and you have to actually believe that you matter. You're both nothing and you're everything. If you can achieve that mindset, then all kinds of extraordinary things are possible in prayer. If you can be that awake and that aware of your utter nothingness and and the ways in which you matter immensely and extraordinarily, then you can daven. So we thought, what if we start from scratch? Could we actually build a place where someone had to walk through two doors to enter in? Not two doors physically. We're in the JCC. They tell us how many doors are in there, and there are many actually to get in. But two doors psychologically and spiritually in order to enter into the prayer space. And something happens when people know that that's what's being asked of them once the service starts. It doesn't work immediately, and it doesn't work every single time, but eventually, that's what we're going for. That's the kavanah that drives the keva of our Friday night service and our Shabbos morning davening.
When Heschel wrote, the word spirituality was not a used word. In fact, if anything, it was used to mean superstition. When Kaplan used the word, he used it as an insult, somehow in the end of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st century, this word became very powerful. And it's now become part of the vocabulary. It's become positive, not negative, and it's become part of a very useful vocabulary. What does that word mean to you?
So, one of the interesting findings from the Pew study that came out a couple of weeks ago that I'm sure you've been talking about is how many people identify as Jews, but Jews of no religion, right? And of course, and it grows generationally. So most people who come from the Great Generation, they're going to, if they identify as a Jew, that means I'm a Jew, and my religion is also Judaism. When people come from the generation after me, so it really very much less so. They identify as Jews because they have either a Jewish mother or they were raised Jewish, but they identify as Jews of no religion. And I think one of the things that's happening now is that we have stripped the meaning of religion out of religion, okay? So what is religion? We've made it actually just essentially about the perfunctory and rote and sort of systematic engagement in Jewish ritual, right? We've made religion about keva and not about kavanah. Once that happened, we needed a language to articulate what kavanah is. If religion for Heschel wasn't just about keva, it was about the marriage between keva and kavanah. But when religion became just about, I need to show up in shul on time, and I'm going to do, pages 20 to 134 before I get to eat. If that's what religion is, I need something to express the movement of the heart. To express wonder and longing and awe and amazement. What's that? That's spirituality. Now, it's a false distinction, obviously, because really what we want to build out is a religious structure that can hold keva and kavanah together. But I think that spirituality is the label that emerges once you diminish religion and make it something much smaller than Heschel imagined religion to actually be.
So I think that one of the questions that emerges from both the study and also, I guess, from our common experience is that we know lots of young people, however you define that, but lots of young people who will tell you that they like being Jewish, but they would never ever set foot in a shul, in a synagogue, and that Jewish ritual, Jewish prayer means almost nothing to them because they find it very empty. And the IKAR community has been successful in inviting those people in. What do you say to those people? So what do you say to I'm spiritual but not religious, I'm proud to be Jewish but I have no religion, I like hanging out on the beach in Venice and Santa Monica and just breathing the air, and that's my spirituality. What is it that you have said? What is it that you say to that young person to invite them into a Jewish community, to a Jewish circle? Want to drink some water first? Have a grape?
So what I found, I talk to a lot of young unaffiliated Jews. That's who I spend most of my time with. And what I found is that what they reject about Judaism has nothing to do with Judaism. Right? Talk to your children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews who are most disconnected and ask them what it is that they're actually rejecting. What they reject is a kind of formality and stiffness and a roteness, if that's a word. Is that a word? Yeah?
It is now.
It should be. That I think is more reflective of American Protestantism than Judaism. Right? So I think it's a reflection of this sort of cultural desire among Jews in the middle of the 20th century to be like everybody else. And even though we were going to be in synagogue instead of church, our synagogue was going to look and feel a lot like a church. We're going to put organs in. Organs are not intrinsically Jewish. They're Christian, and they come into the Jewish prayer space because that's what our neighbors are doing, and we want to feel like them, and we want them to know we're not so different from them. So the formality of prayer, the idea of being polite in services, tell me if I'm wrong here, I
You
think...
should know that at VBS we're not polite.
That's good. I get very nervous when people are too polite in services. When we have a lot of guests, you can tell, because people are sitting very quietly and passively, and they stand only when I ask them to please stand up, and they don't move. They don't know how to move. They don't ever interrupt. They don't ever cry. Nobody's crying. Nobody's standing. So then I have to stop the service and say, you're not here to be polite. You're here to pray. So let's talk about what that might look like. It doesn't look like this, right? What I believe alienates a lot of young people from Jewish religious life is a lot of those elements of the kind of the containers that we created to hold Jewish religious life in America in the 20th century, which are completely foreign, by the way, to many Israelis. They come here and they're like, what are these massive buildings, these big structures, and the formality of prayer? Where are the kids? Why aren't they screaming and running up and down the aisles? It sort of makes... This is a distinctly American experience, I believe. And it's one that doesn't speak to people anymore, as it should be. People grow. With each new generation, there's a new vibe, there's a new way of communicating and speaking. And most young people that I encounter don't want to be spoken to by someone who's 5 or 10 feet up off the ground wearing a robe. They just want to be... They want to be in dialogue, in conversation. There's nothing fundamentally Jewish about what it is that they're rejecting. They're rejecting the conventions of the institution that holds the Jewish stuff, the good stuff. But they're not rejecting the good stuff. I have yet to meet a young, disaffected, anti-religious American Jew who rejects the idea of pressing pause on their life as it is for 25 hours a week and instead imagining their life as it could be. They don't reject Shabbos. They reject the idea that the way to experience Shabbos is to walk into an institutional environment where people might be judging you for what you're wearing, where you're always doing something wrong. You're wearing a tallis and it's nighttime. You didn't know you weren't supposed to. You're not wearing a tallis and it's morning time. You didn't know you were supposed to, right? We're almost always doing something wrong. And it's an uncomfortable way to engage. So the question is, so what do we say to young, disaffected Jews? Here's the good stuff. Take a taste of the good stuff, right? Maybe you need to experience the idea of Shabbos totally outside of a conventional institutional environment to know that there's worth tasting here, that there's something worth engaging. So, we make a video, a 1-minute video about Shabbat, that just tries to put in words, with nothing spoken out loud, just in words, what is the essence of Shabbat? It's that you are fundamentally a human being, and you are not, at the end of the day, your failures, and you are not even your successes and achievements. You are human, and because of your humanity, you are capable of mighty and extraordinary things in the world. So sometimes you need to turn it off in order to turn it on, and to take the essence of the thing and put it out into Venice, right? And put it in someone's living room, because they're not scared of being in each other's living rooms. They're scared of being in institutional spaces. And all of a sudden, people realize that Shabbos is actually delicious, right? I want more of that stuff. That's totally counter to the message I'm getting elsewhere in the world, which is you don't fundamentally matter. And now I realize maybe I matter a little bit. And maybe not only do I matter, but I don't matter at all. It's not all about me, which is totally counter to the message I'm getting out there in the world, which is it's all about you. And all of a sudden, I realize that Judaism is saying it's not all about you all the time. I want more of that. So I want for our Jewish religious and spiritual experiences not to be contained in containers that people reject, but instead give them the essence of the thing wherever they are. They're not scared of bars and cafes and studios. Bring it there and talk about what Judaism has to offer. Don't create some new religion, but bring the good stuff from the old religion and talk about it in new environments and in new and different and creative ways.
One of the attacks, critiques, and maybe it's a perennial one, generation to generation, is that older folks look at younger folks and say, you're narcissistic, you're self-centered, Your individualism has become even more radical than our individualism. Everything has to appeal to you. When we were kids, you went into a shop and had a cup of coffee for a quarter. You folks want a double calf, half calf, latte, non-fat. So the question is, how do you speak to that, to a generation that has been told since the time they were young, it's all about you. You're the center of the universe. Your satisfaction, your fulfillment, your achievement, your success, that's what matters most. And how do you talk that kid into joining a community, into caring about a community?
First, I'm going to tell you what we don't do, because I am the product of a very watered-down Judaism. Right. The fear of the Jewish community that I grew up in was that people were growing more and more distant with each generation from their Jewish traditions and their Jewish heritage. So what do we need to do? We'll make a safety net. We'll strip away the Hebrew, because people don't know Hebrew anymore. Services are too long, we'll make them an hour. Right? You feel uncomfortable when you encounter something you don't know, pull all the hard stuff away, and it will catch you. And you'll be totally unchallenged, but at least you'll still be here. So what I think the instinct is to say this is the most narcissistic generation in the history of the world, which sociologists do say about people in their 20s and 30s today. Partially, by the way, it might be true. Partially it's because of technology and because people have access to things like double calf, half calf, soy, vanilla that they never had before. Part of it's because their parents raised them thinking that, the way to raise a child is to say that every single scribble on a piece of paper is amazing art and framing it. I don't know exactly why it is, but this is an incredibly narcissistic generation. The instinct is, okay, so strip away the hard stuff, right? Because this is a demographic that will not respond to challenge. Because they don't need to be challenged. They can buy the music they want. They don't need to sit and listen to the radio for their song to come on anymore. They're just going to grab the song that they want. And for 99 cents they can have it. So there have been a number of efforts, and I will say millions and millions of Jewish philanthropic dollars have been dedicated to the cause of sort of stripped away trendy Judaism. What do we know about these people? They don't like ritual. They don't like intensity. They don't want to be pushed in a language that they don't know, in an environment that they're uncomfortable in. They really like music. So we're going to throw them a concert. This generation, what do they like? They love art. So what we're going to do is just create an art center. And it'll be Jews in the art center, but only art. So here's the thing. That's really good for a short period, but it doesn't last. So what I'm trying to do is build out a robust and rich and thick Jewish experience that knows our customer, right? We know who the people are who are coming in. We know that they can get Netflix. And Netflix, right? We don't have Blockbuster anymore. We don't go to the movies anymore, first, let's say, right? Then there's no Blockbuster. Then you don't have to leave your home. You just press a button on your computer and you have the movie that you want in your home. If that's the society and the culture that we live in, so how do you engage this population in a serious conversation about responsibility and obligation, particularly when it's inconvenient? And when you have to invest hour upon hour upon hour of your life to even learn the basic language to understand what's going on. So our instinct is to strip away the hard stuff and just serve it up to them in a way that's totally delicious, and they'll get it. But it's the wrong instinct, because actually what this most narcissistic generation in the history of the world wants is to be challenged. Because everywhere else, it's really easy. They get exactly what they want for 99 cents. Right? And what they really appreciate is someone saying, you're smarter than that. You're better than that. Let me introduce you to an idea that is so complex and so rich that you're not going to get it for many months and maybe many years. But eventually when you do, it's going to shake you to the core, and it's going to center you and ground you and give you a sense of what it means to be a Jew and a human being in the world. So this is totally counterintuitive. I know and I understand this, but I also know that it works. Because for some reason people are showing up, right? And it's hard. It's not easy. It's all in Hebrew, right? And it's not a short service. Even for me, sometimes it's a little bit too long, and yet it's challenging, and people like to be challenged. They like, in a world where everything's easy, for someone to say, you are smarter than that. And I'm going to push you to the depths to say what's really going on in your heart, what's going on in your mind, and maybe we can stretch you beyond what's comfortable and see what's possible here. I can give an example, but maybe you have a different question.
Give the example.
I mean, we started doing, I maybe have shared this with you at
Give
Harvard.
the example.
So I read a study of this guy, Lev Shestov, who, yes, do you know what I'm about to say?
Go ahead.
So he did this study with pike fish. He took a fish tank and he put a glass wall, a separator, in the middle of the tank. And he had on one side, he had a fish that wants to eat other fish, and he had on the other side fish that just want to live. They don't want to be eaten by another fish, okay? And what he witnessed, he just watched, observed what would happen. So the fish that wants to eat the other fish doesn't understand glass, and that you can see through, that you can see through it means he can swim through it. So he swims up and bangs his head against the wall. And then he goes back, retreats, nurses the wound, and swims up against the wall again. And does this like 5 or 6 or 20 times. And eventually realizes that there's a glass divider that's separating him from the yummy fish, right? And stops swimming over into their area. At a certain point, Lev Shestov pulls up the glass separator. So what do you think happens? Nothing, right? The hungry fish-eating fish stays in his area, and the fish who would feel incredibly threatened to know that this hungry fish is just right over there, they feel totally safe and fine because they become habituated to their limitations, right? And I think that we do the same thing in prayer as Jews. We become habituated to our own limitations. We assume that we cannot experience something different from what we experienced last year. So I don't know how you do Korim here during Aleinu on the High Holiest. Do you go down? Does everyone go down? Right? So some people go down. Does everyone go down? What's the tradition here?
A lot of people do.
A lot of people do.
The good ones do.
The ones who
really
don't.
want a good New Year, yeah.
The ones who don't, maybe it's because you have a bad back or you're afraid you're not going to be able to get back up afterwards, which is totally legit. But some of us don't go down because we're afraid of what's going to happen if we do. We're afraid that something's going to happen to the heart, and it feels so un-Jewish. Right? It feels like that's what Muslims do. Muslims go down to the ground. We don't bow down to anybody. We're Jews. Right? So we're afraid that something might happen, or we know that nothing will happen, like the pike fish, right? I know nothing will happen, so I'm not even going to try. So sometimes what we have to do is actually push people into the space that will make them most uncomfortable and push ourselves. But all of us, this is happening to me as the person leading the service as much or more than it's happening to the community of people present. Push ourselves into the space of complete and utter discomfort just so that we're forced to see if something might happen. So I feel if you give a Jew a chair, the Jew will sit down in that chair. Even if the way to move your heart is to stand up and move around. You'll sit, especially if you're given a comfortable chair, right?
So we've taken care of that.
So what do you do? We take away the chairs. I have a few chairs that are set up on the side of the room. Right. Not all the time. If you come on Shabbos morning, you'll get a chair. But on Friday night, we take away the chairs. And the few people who need to actually sit down because it would be, unsafe or really, really uncomfortable for them, they sit down. But everybody else is uncomfortable in a spiritual way, and they're mad at me, and they feel frustrated, and why did I come here, and this is weird, and I just wish that they would give me a chair, and I don't want to be part of some experiment. You know what happens? After 20 minutes, they're dancing, because they're on their feet, and they're uncomfortable, and they're being thrust out of their, out of the habituation, out of the place, the mindset that habituates us to the fact that nothing could ever happen to me in a prayer service that will take me by surprise. Heschel says there's no adventure of the soul anymore. There's no surprise. Nothing happens in the prayer service that surprises you. You walk in one day and there are no chairs in the room, you'll be surprised. right? And you'll be surprised at how angry you are at your rabbis. And then if you stick it out, you might be surprised a few minutes in about how that your heart is moving in a way that it didn't move last time when you were sitting comfortably and falling asleep, bored, right? Not that that would happen here, but in many other places that's what happens. So I think part of the challenge is to move ourselves into the place of discomfort, which is completely countercultural, because our whole culture is built around giving people as much comfort as they can possibly have, and we demand comfort, right? We have like incredible customer service here. We want to be made as comfortable as possible all the time, and I think that the Jewish religious life starts from a place of profound discomfort. And if you're too comfortable, nothing will move you. Maybe it's about chairs. Maybe it's about sitting in a different seat than you're used to sitting in. Maybe it's about hearing my voice singing instead of Hillel's, which sounds a whole lot nicer, right? And it's about discomfort. Moving to a place or a position that just, you have no idea what's going on, but that discomfort makes you vulnerable in a way that makes our hearts start to move. And I think that's where the religious journey starts.
Mm-hmm. So the Pew study came out a couple of weeks ago, and what the community does when this kind of thing happens is they appoint lots of committees, right? And they start having commissions and meetings, and they bring people in to speak. So I'm gonna save the community a lot of money. What should we do? The intermarriage rate among Jews married since 2008 is something like 58%. There's an enormous number of young Jews who have no religion. There's an enormous amount of disaffiliation and disaffection. And rather than have some blue ribbon committee, both in terms of investing the attention, the money, the power of this great community, which still is rather substantial, what would we do? I'm giving you control of the community, of the whole American Jewish community. You get 10 minutes to play God. All the money you want.
Wow.
Federation raised $49 million last year. It's yours. Do something with it.
I know exactly what I would do with it.
Go ahead. Well, tell them. I want to know.
So, first, I want to say that you should first and foremost support the capital campaign of VBS. That's very important. But when you're done, if there's anything left over, I think that we need to really push ourselves as a community to think differently about not only the substance of what we're preaching and what we're sharing, but the delivery mechanism. And the delivery mechanism doesn't have to be one that resonates with all of you or even with me. We're trying to reach people, right? And people are going to be, in every generation, people are going to be reached in different ways. And so when we figure out a way to actually reach a population of people that doesn't want to walk into a synagogue, that won't walk into Federation, that if the Pew people had called them up, they would hang up the phone, right? If we figure out the delivery mechanisms to actually to send the good substantive Jewish stuff to the people who desperately need it and actually hunger for it, even though they don't know that. So we have to support that. I've seen in the last decade, IKAR is almost 10 years old, and I've seen several really extraordinary Jewish efforts that have just died because it's really hard to start something from scratch. It's really hard to create new initiatives that should have worked and been sustained within established communities and entirely new communities that needed some help getting off the ground and becoming sustainable, that just can't at the end of the day pay the bills. And I think that's really tragic when that happens, because sometimes people know how to create the delivery mechanism that's going to share the incredible, immense, magnificent power of our tradition with a generation that doesn't resonate to the old container but needs a new container. So let's go out and deliver it differently and see how people will receive it. I want to make a point about intermarriage, which may make everybody angry. I don't know. I don't think, when these studies come out, we treat intermarriage like it's the cause of the downfall of the Jewish people rather than the effect. Okay? Let me just say it again. We treat intermarriage like it's the cause. Intermarriage is the reason that the Jews are disappearing. Instead of intermarriage is the effect. And then asking ourselves, so what's the cause? What's going on here? Why is it that these, gorgeous, brilliant young Jewesses and Jews are going off and marrying outside the faith? There's some really interesting answers to that question, but we too often don't ask that question because we're too busy wringing our hands and trying to figure out, the problem of intermarriage and how we should berate our children and grandchildren when they come home with a non-Jewish boyfriend. It seems to me that when people walk into a Jewish communal experience and they're bored, they're unstimulated, they feel socially uninterested by the people that they're meeting there, they feel like it's been dumbed down or watered down, they leave. When they leave, they go to the boardwalk in Venice where there are really good bars and restaurants, and they meet people who share their interests, who are stimulated by the same things there. Some of them are Jews, some of them are not Jews. That's how intermarriage happens. If we can't create the kind of Jewish experiences that are compelling enough to actually move people to want to be in Jewish environments where they're going to find each other and have hot and holy Jewish romance with each other, so then they're gone. And it seems to me that instead of wringing our hands over the intermarriage rates, and also instead of then saying, so then we should just do intermarriages, which is what a lot of our colleagues say, I think instead we have to be asking the question of why is this happening? Why are these rates growing so significantly? And once people intermarry, how do we bring them in so that their grandchildren will actually identify as Jews? Because the study shows that the likelihood is, which we know everything the Pew study told us. We have all known all of this before, but it's important to see the stats. That the grandchildren of intermarried couples are the likelihood of them being Jewish it's minute. It's almost like statistically insignificant, which means that when you intermarry, it really means that 2 generations later you're carrying on the Jewish the Jewish story. So instead, we can bemoan that, or we can actually welcome people into our communities and say, like, it's okay with me if your husband wants to pray in a church and you want to pray here. Welcome. You want to come for Shabbos? Right? That's actually an okay way to respond to intermarriage rates. Not by saying I will now perform intermarriages or I'm so scared of intermarriage that I don't want the model of an intermarried family to be in my community. I learned when I was in seminar, in fifth-year seminar in rabbinical school, that when someone in your community gets engaged to a non-Jew, no announcement, no mazel tov, no acknowledgement, nothing. It's as if no marriage happened. Do we not understand how precious love is? And what it means in this world, in this day and age, to actually find someone who can look at you and see you, and who you can see and appreciate as a human being? Maybe that's something we should celebrate instead of bemoan. And maybe if we celebrate love, we actually end up bringing people into a community and an environment that's built on shared values, that's all about wonder and about social responsibility and about working for the transformation of ourselves and our community and our world. And maybe when we do that, those people are going to have Jewish kids, because they get how valuable and important it is for the Jewish message and Jewish narrative to be carried on to the future. So my little moment of provocative, write me your angry letters, not Rabbi Feinstein, he doesn't deserve them, and maybe you say the same things and more so, I don't know. But to answer your question, it's very, very hard to reach people who don't want to be in this conversation. That doesn't mean they don't hunger for meaning. It doesn't mean that they don't have real existential questions about what it means to be a Jew and a human being. It doesn't mean that they won't be touched by Shabbos, by holy eating, by the whole idea of distinction and differentiation and holiness in the act of eating, aka kashrut. Right? It doesn't mean that they won't be touched by the possibility of Yom Kippur to radically and undeniably and permanently transform your life, my favorite day of the year, Yom Kippur. It doesn't mean that they don't want this. It means that we're not connecting with them in the right way. So how do you solve the problem of the Pew study? If you find a way to connect with them, support it, sustain it. Don't let it die off like my friends' organizations that have died off, right? support the delivery mechanism for getting the good stuff out into the world.
What's your favorite Heschel?
Book?
Yeah,
Oh, I'm going to tell
saying,
you.
piece.
Can I tell
Paragraph.
you? Okay, this is one.
You brought one, so read
brought
us something.
one.
Read us a piece.
Okay, you're not. I don't think you know what I'm going to read. So this is my favorite book. It's called The Insecurity of Freedom, which is a series of essays on human existence. So it happens at the Jewish Theological Seminary once a year that the library needs to unload all their extra books, and so they put little stickers on it. It's either 50 cents or $1 or $1.50. And there are thousands of books, and they hold all those rabbinical students behind a rope, and then they pull the rope, and everybody charges the table, and they're elbowing each other. It's like the shuk on a Friday afternoon. So I go up to the table, and I grab every book I can get my hands on, and then you throw back the ones you don't want, and I see this book. I've never heard of The Insecurity of Freedom, but it's a Heschel, so I buy it. It's like 50 cents. I get home, and it turns out that this book comes from the library of Shalom Spiegel.
Ooh.
Yeah. And
great professor of Jewish literature.
Who had his office right next to Heschel.
Right.
And in it, he's got these scraps of paper, these little yellowed scraps that include obits that were written about Heschel, that include notices to the JTS faculty when Heschel became ill. And it also includes what is my favorite Heschel, thank you for asking, which is a letter that was written by Abraham Joshua Heschel to the faculty of the Jewish Theological Seminary on October 20th, 1972. So it's 3 months before he dies. He writes this letter. Can I read it?
Yeah, please.
I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'll read part of it, because I don't want you to lose your 501c3. Okay, dear colleague, it says. I know you're worried about that. The forthcoming election.
Full of lawyers. I'm not afraid. Go ahead.
So this is the night before the election of 1972. Okay, so you might know where this is going. The forthcoming election confronts every one of us as American citizens and as Jews with a truly momentous decision. Our country today is in a state of profound moral and political crisis. In a free society, some are guilty, all are responsible. At this serious moment of American history, I feel a deep sense of responsibility for the moral decline and confusion in our sense of priorities. He's writing this to the faculty of the Jewish Theological Seminary. Okay. Heschel was a person who, along with Mordechai Kaplan, people would get in the elevator with him. If he was in the elevator and they're going, no, they wait for the next, okay. Now you'll know why. If the prophets Isaiah and Amos were to appear in our midst, would they accept the corruption in high places, the indifferent way in which the sick, the poor, and the old are treated? Would they condone the indifference to gun control legislation that has allowed some of the finest of our national leaders to be shot dead? Would not our prophets be standing with those who protest against the war in Vietnam, the decay of our cities, the hypocrisy and falsehood that surround our present administration even at the highest level? The Jewish people does not recognize governments of men as sanctified. It's God's law that is sanctified, and demands of each of us the compassion to regard our fellow men as brothers. Only if we are prepared to criticize and correct the wrongs we commit against each other will society be perfected. Surely it is the duty of any religious leader to help change a society that tolerates a rising level of violence, that ignores our common humanity, that calmly accepts civilian slaughter in far-off lands, that glorifies killing on movie and TV screens and calls it entertainment, that makes it easy for men of all shades of sanity to acquire whatever weapons and ammunition they desire. Then he demands or calls upon the faculty to vote for one particular candidate in the national election. You can guess who.
You can tell us who it is.
You want to guess?
It hasn't been.
Okay. And then he says, we must elect George McGovern to the presidency of the United States because the needs of America and the values of our Jewish heritage demand it. Sincerely, Abraham Joshua Heschel. I love this. I've never seen this in a book anywhere. No.
No. Okay. I don't know if you know this, but McGovern lost. I don't know if you knew that.
I'm aware. I remember. I was born a year later. I know. I heard it, and I learned about it in history.
What? He swept
He took
Massachusetts, and that was the front page of my college newspaper. The next morning it said, McGovern sweeps Massachusetts. You know, that was the front page of the paper.
But here, can I just say, I mean, obviously this speaks for itself. Not only is Heschel's critique of the synagogue as relevant today as it was 35, 40 years ago, but his critique of American politics and the American citizenry that is all too willing to sit silently around policies that are utterly corrupt from the top to the bottom. It seems to me exactly the same. We're not in such a different place today than we were then. I love the courage of a man to stand up with his colleagues who he knew wouldn't be happy to hear this, and to say it anyway, right? And for that, I think we are forever indebted to Abraham Joshua Heschel.
Thank you to Sharon Brous. Please come back next week. We'll continue our conversation with Rabbi Chaim Seidler-Feller. Thank you so much.